I was halfway through my glass of cheap red wine when my father cleared his throat and tapped his fork against his plate. The sound cut cleanly through the room, sharp and practiced the way it always had. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. Chairs shifted. Even the Christmas music playing softly in the background seemed to fade, as if it knew better than to compete with him. The lights on the tree blinked steadily, reflected in the polished surface of the dining table my mother only used on holidays. I watched his hand rest there for a moment, fingers spread, claiming space before he even spoke. Then his eyes landed on me, slow and deliberate, like he was appraising something he'd already decided had little value. "Well," he said, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the room, "here comes the family beggar." A few people laughed. Not the kind of laughter that comes from humor, but the careful, reflexive kind. The kind that says, "I'm not getting involved." My sister leaned back in her chair as if this were a performance she'd seen before and enjoyed every time. She lifted her glass and added with a bored little smile, "Honestly, I wish I didn't even have a sister like you." The words hit, but they didn't surprise me. That was the strangest part. I felt them land where they always had, somewhere deep and familiar, like muscle memory. I turned my head slightly and looked at my mother. She was folding her napkin, unfolding it, smoothing it flat against her thigh. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fabric as if looking up might force her to choose a side. She didn't say a word. No one noticed that my hands were steady. No one noticed that my face didn't change. They were used to other reactions from me. Apologies. Explanations. Quiet embarrassment. What they weren't used to was stillness. What they didn't know was that I hadn't come back for Christmas to ask for acceptance. I hadn't come to prove anything or beg for a place at this table. I had come because something they were about to lose had already passed through my hands, and I was the only one in the room who understood what that meant. The house smelled the way it always did during the holidays. Roasted meat, cinnamon, pine from the tree in the corner. My aunt sat 2 seats down from me, lips pressed together in a polite line, pretending to focus on her plate. My cousins avoided my eyes entirely. Someone cleared their throat and reached for another roll as if food could smooth over the tension. I took another sip of wine and let the silence stretch. It was uncomfortable, and I let it stay that way. This table had shaped me more than any classroom or workplace ever had. The solid oak surface bore the marks of years of family dinners, arguments that never quite reached the surface, celebrations that always seemed to center around someone else. It was here that I learned how power worked when it didn't need to announce itself. Here that I learned whose voice mattered and whose didn't. My father leaned back in his chair, clearly satisfied. He liked moments like this. He liked to test how far he could go, how much space he could take without resistance. To him, power wasn't about outcomes. It was about reaction. The sharper the insult, the smaller he expected me to become. My sister watched him with admiration that bordered on worship. She had grown up in his shadow, protected by it, shaped by the certainty that she belonged at the center of everything. She didn't even look at me again. To her, the moment was already over. Conversation resumed slowly, awkwardly. Someone commented on the weather. Someone else asked about travel plans. The clink of silverware filled the gaps where words felt risky. My father launched into a story about work, his voice growing louder and more confident as attention drifted back to him as it always did. I listened. He spoke about a deal he was certain would go through, about people he trusted, about timelines he assumed were fixed. He talked the way men do when they've been right often enough that they stop imagining the possibility of being wrong. Heads nodded around the table. My sister chimed in, occasionally reinforcing his points, correcting small details, basking in the way he smiled at her. I noticed something else. Across the table, someone glanced at their phone, frowned, and slipped it back into their pocket. A moment later, they checked it again, more subtly this time. No one commented, but I filed it away. Small details had always mattered to me. They were often the only warnings you got. I hadn't always been this observant. There was a time when I believed that if I explained myself better, if I worked harder, if I stayed kinder, things might change. I used to think fairness lived somewhere inside effort. That belief didn't survive this house. My father laughed loudly at his own joke, slapping the table with an open palm. My sister laughed with him a little too quickly. My mother smiled faintly, then stood to refill a glass that didn't need refilling. I cut a piece of meat I didn't plan to eat and thought about how many versions of myself had sat at this table over the years. The younger one who waited for approval. The quieter one who learned not to expect it. The older one who stopped measuring herself against reactions she couldn't control. The story my father was telling reached its conclusion, and he looked around the table satisfied. "That's how it's done," he said. "Experience counts for something." I almost smiled. Experience only counts if you're still paying attention. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time that felt thicker here, heavier. Part of me recognized how easy it would be to stand up, excuse myself, and leave. No one would stop me. No one would ask me to stay. They would tell the story later as evidence of my sensitivity, my inability to take a joke. I had heard that version before. But I stayed. Because beneath the noise and the familiar rhythms, something had shifted. Not in me. In the assumptions holding this room together. My father mentioned a name again. A company. A future he spoke of as guaranteed. His confidence was unshaken, but it rested on information that was no longer accurate. He didn't know that. No one here did. I felt the tightening in my chest, then not anxiety, but clarity. The kind that comes when you see the full shape of something you'd only glimpsed before. The kind that tells you this moment matters more than it looks like it does. They thought they knew who I was. They thought they knew my limits. They thought this table still belonged to them, that the rules were fixed and the hierarchy permanent. I set my fork down gently. The sound, barely registered, lost beneath another burst of laughter from my sister. My mother finally looked up. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Hers held a question she didn't ask. Mine held an answer she wouldn't want to hear. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about responsibility. About what happens when the person you've ignored for years turns out to be the only one who understands the consequences of your confidence. The Christmas lights blinked again, steady and indifferent. My father raised his glass in a toast to success, to family, to traditions he believed were unbreakable. Everyone lifted their glasses, some eagerly, some out of habit. I raised mine too. My sister leaned toward a cousin, whispering something that made them laugh. She didn't notice the tension building beneath the surface. She never had. She'd never needed to. Another phone vibrated. Someone excused themselves briefly, stepping into the hallway to take a call. My father waved them off with a joke about work intruding on family time. The laugh that followed was thinner this time. I sat there quietly, my posture relaxed, my attention sharp. I felt no urge to speak, no desire to correct anyone. Correction implies a need to be understood. I had moved past that. What I felt instead was readiness. I understood how the next few hours would unfold. Not in detail, but in shape. I knew that whatever was coming wouldn't announce itself with drama. It would arrive the way truth often does, through process and timing, through systems that don't care about feelings or family roles. They still didn't see me as relevant. They still thought the evening belonged to them, that their version of reality would hold. The difference was that I knew it wouldn't. As dessert was served and the conversation drifted, I stayed exactly where I was present, and silent, already aware that this Christmas dinner would not end the way it always had. Not this time. Something had shifted beyond their control, and I was the only one at the table who knew it. What happened at the Christmas table didn't shock me. That was the truth I didn't say out loud. The words themselves weren't new, not really. They were just louder this time, dressed up for an audience sharpened by years of practice. My father hadn't suddenly become cruel that night. He'd simply spoken the version of himself that had always existed, the one everyone else had learned to excuse. In our house, nothing had to be repeated to become permanent. Roles were assigned early, reinforced quietly, and then treated as facts of nature rather than choices. My father didn't declare himself the authority. He behaved as if authority had always belonged to him, and everyone else arranged their lives around that assumption. My mother arranged herself into calm. My sister arranged herself into importance. I arranged myself into absence. I learned early that attention was a limited resource, something to be earned and rationed. My father spent it strategically. He invested it where he expected returns. My sister received it freely, generously, as if her potential were fragile and needed constant reinforcement. I received it only when something went wrong, when there was a correction to be made or a flaw to be pointed out. Praise, when it appeared at all, was brief and conditional. A nod. A single sentence. Never in front of other people. Never long enough to settle anywhere safe. Approval was something you borrowed, not something you kept. It wasn't that my sister was born unkind. She simply grew into the space that had been cleared for her. She was asked for her opinion at the table, encouraged to speak even when she didn't know much yet. When she failed, explanations followed. When she succeeded, celebration came easily. Confidence wasn't something she had to build. It was handed to her fully formed, reinforced, daily. I learned something different. I learned to watch faces, to read the room before I spoke, to anticipate moods and adjust my tone accordingly. If my father came home tired, I stayed quiet. If he was in a good mood, I stayed agreeable. I learned which questions irritated him and which ones earned a distracted nod. I learned that being easy was safer than being right. My mother noticed more than she ever admitted. I could see it in the way her eyes flicked toward me when my father interrupted, or how her hand tightened around her glass when a joke went a little too far. Sometimes our eyes met across the table just for a second, and in that glance there was recognition. Not defense, not intervention, just acknowledgement quickly buried. She told herself she was keeping the peace, that things weren't bad enough to justify conflict. That silence was a form of protection. It never felt like protection from where I stood. The moments that shaped me weren't dramatic. There was no single argument that split the family open, no explosive betrayal that could be pointed to later as the beginning of the end. There were small things instead, consistent things, decisions made without consulting me, conversations that shifted the moment I joined them, plans that included me only after everything else had been decided. At family gatherings, my sister's stories took center stage. Everyone leaned in, questions followed, advice was offered freely. When I spoke, heads nodded politely, then turned away. Attention drifting back to something more interesting. It was subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. Subtle enough that for a long time I wondered if I was imagining it. I wasn't. By the time I was a teenager, the pattern was undeniable. Effort didn't change the shape of things. I could excel, quietly achieve without spectacle, and the response would remain the same. Approval, when it came, was fleeting and fragile. It didn't protect me the next time. It didn't change the assumptions already in place. So I stopped reaching for it. That decision didn't feel brave. It felt practical. I learned how to make myself smaller without disappearing entirely. I learned to solve my own problems. I learned not to ask for help that wouldn't come. Independence for me wasn't a declaration or a rebellion. It was a survival strategy. The family didn't resist this shift. In fact, they seemed relieved by it. My self-sufficiency made their lives easier. I didn't demand attention. I didn't create conflict. I didn't force anyone to choose sides. I fit neatly into the background, reliable and unobtrusive. My father liked to describe me as low maintenance. He meant it as a compliment. By the time I left for college, the role was fully cemented. My sister was the one with potential, with plans, with a future that mattered. I was the one who would manage, who would be fine, who didn't need much. That assumption followed me wherever I went. It shaped the questions they asked and the ones they didn't bother with. When I called home, conversations stayed shallow. How was school? Was I eating enough? Was I seeing anyone? The answers they seemed satisfied with were short ones. When I tried to explain what I was studying or why it mattered to me, my father interrupted with advice that didn't apply, and the conversation drifted somewhere safer. Eventually, I stopped trying. It wasn't secrecy. It was alignment. I gave them exactly what they were comfortable hearing. Nothing more. There was a moment late one night in my early 20s when the pattern finally clarified itself. I was sitting alone in a small apartment I could barely afford, listening to the steady hum of traffic outside my window, when the realization settled quietly into place. I wasn't misunderstood. I was unseen. The difference mattered. Being misunderstood suggests an error that can be corrected. Being unseen means no one is looking closely enough to be wrong. That understanding didn't hurt the way earlier realizations had. It felt oddly steady, like standing on solid ground after years of balancing on something unstable. I understood then that waiting for my family to notice me was an investment that would never pay off. From that point on, I adjusted my expectations. I stopped measuring myself against their reactions. I stopped hoping my father would one day look at me the way he looked at my sister. I stopped interpreting my mother's silence as temporary. I took the family as it was, not as it might become. That acceptance changed everything. Without the constant effort of proving myself, I had space to focus on what actually mattered. I made decisions based on usefulness rather than approval. I trusted my own judgment because it was the only one consistently available. I learned to rely on preparation instead of permission. Looking back from the Christmas table years later, the insult made sense. Family beggar. It had never been about money. It was about position. About who was allowed to ask and who was expected to accept whatever scraps were offered. The role had been assigned long before that night. The words were just a reminder. As I sat there listening to my father speak, watching my sister bask in her certainty, watching my mother retreat into familiar quiet, I saw the structure clearly. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were repeating what had always worked for them. The difference now was that I no longer believed the story they were telling. I didn't need their permission to exist differently. I didn't need to confront them or correct them or demand recognition. I had already stepped outside the role they'd built for me. They just hadn't noticed yet. And that I understood with calm certainty was going to matter far more than any argument ever could. I left without announcing it. There was no argument at the door, no dramatic declaration about independence or betrayal. I packed what fit into the back of my car, hugged my mother, because that was expected, shook my father's hand because refusing would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer, and drove away before anyone could decide how they felt about my leaving. It didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like oxygen. For the first time in my life, every decision belonged to me alone. There was no one waiting to approve it, correct it, or quietly undermine it. That freedom was terrifying in a way comfort never is. It meant there was no one else to blame if I failed. It also meant no one could take credit if I succeeded. I worked wherever someone would hire me. Long hours. Unremarkable pay. I learned quickly how expensive ignorance could be. How one careless assumption could cost weeks of effort. How discipline mattered more than motivation and preparation mattered more than confidence. I learned to read contracts, to question timelines, to listen closely when someone spoke too easily. There was no audience for any of it. No applause when I paid my rent on time or stayed up late teaching myself what I didn't yet understand. I didn't post updates. I didn't call home with stories that would have sounded like explanations or excuses. My life didn't look impressive from the outside, and that suited me just fine. I wasn't trying to be exceptional. I was trying to be competent. The first real test came sooner than I expected. I was young, still unsteady in my footing, and placed in a position where a decision would affect people who had no idea who I was. There was an easy option. Faster. Cleaner. It would have gone unnoticed and saved time. There was another option that was slower, more complicated, and correct. I chose the second one. It cost me sleep. It cost me goodwill. It cost me the comfort of knowing everyone approved. But when the outcome arrived, it was solid, defensible. Right. The kind of result that doesn't need explanation. No one congratulated me. No one needed to. Something else happened instead. People began to trust my judgment. Quietly at first, then more openly. Not because I demanded authority, but because things went wrong less often when I was involved. That pattern repeated itself over and over. I didn't chase titles. I chased understanding. I paid attention to how decisions were made and who benefited from them. I noticed how power moved when no one was watching. I learned that the most dangerous people weren't the loud ones, but the comfortable ones. The ones who stopped checking their assumptions because things had always worked out before. If my family had asked about any of this, I might have told them. They didn't. Our conversations stayed polite and shallow. Holidays came and went with brief calls and generic questions. Was work going well? Was I healthy? Was I seeing anyone? The answers they seemed satisfied with were the shortest ones. When I tried once to explain what I was working on and why it mattered, my father interrupted with advice that didn't apply, and the conversation drifted somewhere safer. After that, I stopped offering details. It wasn't secrecy. It was alignment. I gave them exactly what they wanted from me, which was very little, and in return, they left me alone. As my responsibilities grew, so did my awareness of timing. I learned that acting too early creates resistance, and acting too late creates regret. I learned that the most effective interventions often look like non-interventions from the outside. A pause. A question left unanswered. A signature not rushed. That kind of power doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. There came a point when I realized my professional world overlapped with something my family depended on. Not directly, not in a way that would have been obvious to anyone else, but enough that the shape of it was unmistakable to me. A name surfaced in a meeting. A structure was referenced casually. Assumptions were made that didn't match reality. I said nothing. Professionalism demands restraint. I had learned that lesson well. You don't warn people who aren't listening. You let systems do what they're designed to do. When I thought about my sister during those years, it wasn't with anger. It was with distance. From what little I heard, she was doing exactly what everyone expected. Advancing smoothly, supported generously, praised often. Doors opened when she knocked, and when they didn't, someone else knocked for her. She didn't need to learn patience. She didn't need to plan for failure. Someone had always softened the landing. Our lives moved on parallel tracks that never crossed. That was fine with me. Comparison loses its power when you stop standing close enough for it to matter. By the time I felt truly steady, truly capable, the idea of explaining myself to my family felt unnecessary. My identity no longer depended on their recognition. I measured my days by usefulness, by clarity, by whether I had done the work that needed doing. Approval had become irrelevant. That shift changed how I carried myself. I spoke less and listened more. I stopped reacting to slights I would have once internalized. I trusted my instincts because they had been sharpened by necessity. I knew when to step forward and when to stay still. Looking back, I can see how invisible that made me to people who weren't paying attention. Confidence that doesn't seek confirmation is easy to overlook. It doesn't perform. It doesn't demand space. It simply occupies it. When the invitation to Christmas arrived, it came without explanation, as if nothing had changed. No apology, no acknowledgement of distance, just a date and a time written in my mother's familiar handwriting. I considered declining. It would have been easier. But something about the timing felt deliberate, even if the intention wasn't conscious. I accepted without comment. Driving back into that familiar neighborhood, I felt no nostalgia. just recognition. The houses looked smaller than I remembered, the streets narrower. The place that had once defined me no longer fit the shape of who I was. At the dinner table, watching my father hold court and my sister bask in her certainty, I understood how completely they had misjudged my life. Not because they were malicious, but because they had stopped looking long ago. The version of me they carried was convenient. It required nothing from them. I didn't correct them. Correction implies a desire to be understood. I had moved beyond that. What I felt instead was a calm awareness of where leverage actually lived, not in volume, not in confrontation, in preparation, in patience, in knowing when a system would correct itself if left alone. As my father spoke about his plans about what he assumed would happen next, I listened the way I listened at work. I noted the confidence, the gaps, the untested assumptions. I recognized the familiar shape of overconfidence built on outdated information. They didn't see me as relevant, and that was their mistake. Not because I intended to punish them for it, but because relevance isn't something you can afford to misjudge when the stakes are real. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate, feeling that quiet alignment settle in my chest. The kind that comes when you know exactly where you stand and what you're capable of. I didn't feel powerful. I felt prepared. They still had no idea who I had become. And for the moment, that worked entirely in my favor. The room felt tighter once I allowed myself to notice it. Not louder, not quieter, just compressed like the air had been slowly pulled inward, and no one wanted to acknowledge the pressure. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let the familiar sounds of the Christmas dinner wash over me. Forks against plates, chairs scraping softly, overlapping conversations that circled the same safe topics without ever touching anything real. From the outside, nothing appeared different. My father still occupied the center of the table without effort. His voice carried naturally steady and assured, shaped by years of being listened to without challenge. My sister sat angled toward him, nodding along, occasionally interrupting with a comment or correction that earned her an indulgent smile. My mother moved between the kitchen and the dining room, collecting plates that weren't empty yet, refilling glasses that didn't need refilling. But I wasn't inside the rhythm anymore. I was watching it. My father launched into another story about work, one he'd clearly told before. It was full of names meant to impress, and conclusions stated as certainty rather than possibility. He spoke like someone who believed the world still responded to him the way it always had. People listened out of habit, their attention drifting in and out, nodding at the right moments. My sister filled in where she could, expanding on his points, reinforcing his confidence. She spoke easily, comfortably, the way someone does when they've never had to doubt their footing. She didn't look at me. I wasn't part of the exchange. I might as well have been furniture. I noticed how freely they talked, how casually they dismissed risks they didn't fully understand, how little weight they gave to the details that actually mattered. There was comfort in their certainty, but also carelessness, the kind that comes from believing consequences belong to other people. My mother hovered at the edge of it all. She laughed at the right moment, shifted topics when things edged too close to tension, smoothed over discomfort before it could solidify. Watching her do it felt like watching muscle memory at work. She wasn't choosing silence. She was defaulting to it. She glanced at me once as she passed behind my chair, her eyes flicking toward my face and away again. There was concern there, maybe even curiosity, but it vanished before I could name it. She was already reaching for another dish, another small task to keep the evening moving. Nothing had changed for her. That realization settled heavily. My father mentioned a deadline and waved it off with a laugh, as if deadlines were suggestions rather than boundaries. My sister echoed his dismissal, bored by the idea that anything could disrupt what she assumed was guaranteed. They spoke like spectators, not participants, as if outcomes were fixed simply because they expected them to be. That was when the shape of it became unmistakable to me. They weren't just dismissing me. They were exposed. The risk they were skating past wasn't abstract. It wasn't distant or theoretical. It was immediate, structural, and tied directly to decisions they were making without understanding the full landscape. Decisions built on assumptions that were no longer true. I kept my face neutral and lifted my glass for a slow sip. I let the moment pass without comment. Power doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly waiting for someone else to misstep. My father leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention. He loved moments like this when the room tilted toward him, when his confidence went unchallenged. He didn't see the fractures forming beneath his certainty. He didn't know where to look. My sister sensed something before she understood it. Her laughter came a little too quickly, a little too sharp. She asked a question she didn't really care about, scanning faces as she spoke, checking for reassurance. When she didn't get it immediately, her brow furrowed before she smoothed it away. Uncertainty unsettled her. She wasn't practiced at sitting with it. I considered speaking up then. The thought crossed my mind briefly, almost casually. A sentence. A clarification. A warning framed as concern. It would have been easy to sound helpful, reasonable, even generous. But the moment passed. My father raised his glass instead, launching into a toast about family tradition and success. Everyone lifted their glasses. Even me. Especially me. The irony tasted sharp, but I swallowed it without reaction. As the glasses came down, I felt the weight of choice settle into my chest. Silence had always been my default in this house, but this was different. This wasn't avoidance. This was intention. I listened more closely now, not as a daughter hoping to be heard, but as someone trained to assess risk. I paid attention to what they said and what they avoided, to the timelines they believed were immovable, to the assumptions they treated as fact. I noted each one mentally the way I would in any other high-stakes situation. They were moving forward as if nothing could touch them, as if the past guaranteed the future, as if experience replaced vigilance. It never does. The mood shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Conversation thinned. Laughter came in shorter bursts. Someone checked their phone again, this time more openly, their expression tightening before they masked it. They excused themselves to take a call in the hallway. No one followed. No one asked. My sister noticed. "Everything okay?" she called after them, her tone light but edged with something sharper. "Probably work," my father said dismissively. "People panic over nothing these days." I almost smiled. I understood then that whatever was coming wouldn't look like the confrontations people imagine when they think of turning points. There would be no raised voices, no dramatic accusations flung across the table, no moment where I stood up and demanded acknowledgement. That kind of conflict belonged to an earlier version of me. This was quieter, more precise. I didn't need to convince them of anything. I didn't need to defend myself or prove relevance. The system was already moving. The mechanisms were already engaged. All that remained was time. Dessert arrived, but few people touched it. The tension lingered unspoken but heavy. My father's stories lost momentum. My sister's confidence wavered, steadied, then wavered again. My mother busied herself clearing plates, her movements quick and restless, as if motion alone could hold the evening together. I sat with my hands folded loosely in my lap, my attention sharp, my body relaxed. I felt no excitement, no satisfaction, just clarity, the kind that comes when you understand the trajectory of something and your role within it. They still didn't see me as a factor. They still believed the table belonged to them, that the rules hadn't changed. The difference was that I knew better. As the evening stretched on, thick with unasked questions and misread signals, I felt a certainty settle deep and calm inside me. This dinner could no longer end the way it always had. Something fundamental had shifted beyond their awareness, and there was no going back. I didn't know exactly how the truth would surface. I didn't need to. All I knew was that the ground beneath them was no longer solid, and I was the only one at the table who felt it cracking. I stepped away from the table without announcing it. I didn't scrape my chair loudly or offer an excuse that invited questions. I simply stood, carried my half-finished glass into the kitchen, and let the noise of the dining room soften behind me. The kitchen felt cooler, calmer. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space steady and indifferent. A clock ticked above the sink, each second clear and unhurried. I set my glass down and rested my hands on the counter, feeling the familiar edge beneath my palms. For the first time all evening, I allowed myself to breathe all the way in. I could leave. The thought came fully formed without emotion attached. I could take my coat, step into the cold night, and drive away while they were still circling dessert and small talk. No one would stop me. No one would follow. By morning, the story would already be written for me, as it always was. I was too sensitive. I couldn't take a joke. I overreacted. I had walked away before. I knew exactly how that version ended. Relief would come first. Immediate, clean, almost intoxicating. The kind of relief that loosens your shoulders and quiets your thoughts. I wouldn't have to watch my father's certainty erode or my sister's confidence fracture. I wouldn't have to hear my mother explain her silence in that careful language she used when she didn't want to admit fear. Leaving would protect me. But protection, I had learned, always extracts a price. I stared out the window at the dark yard, the Christmas lights along the fence blinking steadily, indifferent to whatever tension hung inside the house. Somewhere behind me, silverware clinked again. A burst of laughter surfaced, thin and slightly offbeat. They were moving on already the way they always did. If I left now, the risk I'd recognized wouldn't disappear. It would simply unfold without resistance, exactly as it was already set to do. Consequences would land on people who didn't understand what they'd missed until it was far too late. Silence in this moment wasn't neutral anymore. It was participation. I closed my eyes briefly and let that settle. The door to the hallway creaked open behind me. I turned as a voice said my name low and careful, as if unsure whether to interrupt. It was someone who didn't fully belong to my family's hierarchy, close enough to the situation to see the cracks, distant enough not to be invested in maintaining them. Their expression held professional concern, edged with personal discomfort. "Can I talk to you for a second?" they asked. We moved farther down the hallway, out of earshot of the dining room. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. They didn't need to. "There's a problem," they said quietly. "Not a hypothetical one. A real one. And it's moving faster than they think." I didn't ask them to explain. I already understood the shape of it. They confirmed what I'd suspected, filling in details, tightening timelines. Deadlines weren't flexible. Assumptions weren't holding. Decisions my father spoke about with casual confidence were already being questioned in places he didn't have access to. "I thought you should know," they said finally, "because if nothing changes tonight, tomorrow looks very different." They weren't asking me to fix it. They weren't even asking me to intervene. They were doing something simpler and far more important. They were making sure I couldn't claim ignorance later. I thanked them sincerely and watched as they returned to the warmth and noise of the dining room, slipping back into the evening as if nothing had happened. I stayed where I was, the weight of the choice settling into something solid and undeniable. This wasn't about proving myself. That chapter of my life had closed years ago. I didn't need to be seen as capable or intelligent or successful. I already knew what I was. This was about responsibility. About the kind that comes when you understand how a system works and know exactly what happens when it fails. About the quiet obligation that follows competence whether you ask for it or not. About what it means to stay when leaving would be easier. I thought of all the times I had stayed silent because speaking wouldn't have changed anything. This wasn't one of those times. I picked up my glass and walked back toward the table. No one looked up when I returned. My father was mid-sentence explaining something with confidence that no longer matched reality. My sister nodded along her phone face down beside her plate, already half distracted. My mother glanced at me briefly, relief flickering across her face at my return, as if my presence alone smoothed something jagged she didn't want to examine. I sat down and folded my napkin neatly in my lap. The decision had been made, not aloud, not dramatically, but completely. From that moment on, my silence changed. It was no longer the absence of action. It was restraint, attention. I listened not as a dismissed daughter, but as someone responsible for understanding outcomes. My father talked about what he expected to happen next, laying out plans as if they were inevitable. I noted the gaps, the overconfidence, the places where reality would resist. My sister chimed in with opinions she hadn't earned, echoing his certainty without grasping how fragile it was. I said nothing. Information gathered itself easily once I stopped shrinking from it. Every assumption they voiced revealed something useful. Every joke masked a blind spot. Every dismissal narrowed the range of what they believed possible. At one point, my sister leaned toward me, lowering her voice. "You're quiet tonight," she said, not unkindly, just observant. I met her eyes and smiled faintly. "I'm listening." She laughed, already turning back to my father. She didn't hear the difference. She couldn't have. A subtle shift followed soon after. A phone vibrated and went unanswered for a beat too long. Someone checked the time, frowned, then forced a smile. A comment was made about timing that didn't quite land. My father waved it off. "People overreact," he said. "They always do." I watched his confidence flicker just slightly, as if something inside him had registered a discrepancy he wasn't ready to face. My sister noticed it too. Her smile tightened. She asked a question that went unanswered. The door had closed. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. Whatever was coming wouldn't wait for comfort or consensus. It would move according to rules that didn't care about family dynamics or old hierarchies. The system didn't recognize who had been favored or ignored. It responded only to preparation and timing. As the evening wore on, I felt calm settle over me. Not relief, not anticipation, just steadiness. I had chosen to stay. I had chosen not to protect myself at the expense of others. I had chosen to let the truth surface in its own way, without forcing it, without spectacle. The consequences were already in motion, and as my father raised his voice once more, trying to reclaim the room, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next was no longer something I could avoid. It was something I would see through. I listened with new ears after that. Not the careful, guarded listening I'd learned as a child, but the focused attention of someone tracing the outline of a problem already half solved. Every word at the table carried more weight than the speakers realized. Every assumption revealed something useful. My father continued as if nothing had shifted. He always did. Confidence had been his armor for decades, and he trusted it without question. He spoke about timelines, about people who always came through, about how delays were just noise created by overthinking. He laughed, easily dismissing obstacles as inconveniences meant for less experienced men. I recognized the flaw immediately. Experience only protects you if it evolves. His hadn't. My sister mirrored him instinctively. She repeated his conclusions, sharpened his points, filled in gaps she didn't actually understand. She spoke quickly and confidently, the way people do when uncertainty has never been allowed to linger long enough to teach them anything. Her sense of control came from proximity to his authority, not from comprehension. She mistook familiarity for power. The illusion held for a few minutes longer. I watched it thin. Power doesn't collapse all at once. It stretches first. It hesitates. It frays at the edges. And if no one adapts it, tears. The intersection between my world and theirs was unmistakable now. Names surfaced that I recognized immediately. Structures were referenced casually as if their stability were guaranteed. Numbers were mentioned with confidence that no longer matched reality. They were operating on information that was already outdated, relying on relationships that had quietly shifted beyond their reach. I didn't need to intervene. That was the part they would never understand. The most effective moves I'd made in my life had rarely involved confrontation. They involved timing. allowing systems to do exactly what they were designed to do when no one stepped in to protect ego or preserve illusion. The mechanisms were already in motion. All I had to do was not disrupt them. The first shift was small enough that only I noticed. A phone call my father expected didn't come. He glanced at the clock once, then again, his brow creasing briefly before smoothing out. He made a joke about people being unreliable lately, the laugh just a shade too loud. No one challenged him. My sister laughed a second too late. I felt no satisfaction. Only confirmation. Silence in moments like this isn't emptiness. It's authority. It allows events to reveal themselves without distortion. I stayed quiet, my posture relaxed, my attention sharp. My mother grew restless. She moved more quickly now, refilling glasses that were still half full, clearing plates prematurely. Activity had always been her refuge. If she stayed busy, maybe the ground wouldn't shift beneath her feet. She caught my eye again. This time she didn't look away immediately. There was something tentative in her expression, something searching. I didn't answer it. Answers offered too early have a way of being dismissed. The tension reached my sister next. She sensed it before she understood it. She leaned closer to my father, lowered her voice, asked something I couldn't hear. He shook his head dismissively, though his confidence had softened at the edges. "You worry too much," he said louder than necessary. "Everything's under control." That sentence almost always comes right before it isn't. Dessert was served, but few people touched it. Conversations fractured into smaller clusters. Voices dropped. Laughter sounded forced, like a habit people were maintaining out of reflex rather than enjoyment. The room no longer revolved around my father. It orbited something undefined, something approaching. I thought about how often I'd been underestimated because I didn't announce myself. How often quiet had been mistaken for weakness. The irony was almost gentle. They had built their certainty on the assumption that I didn't matter, and that assumption had left them blind to the shifting landscape beneath them. Another small disruption followed. A confirmation delayed, a timeline adjusted. Nothing dramatic enough to cause panic yet. Just enough to introduce doubt. My sister checked her phone again, this time more openly. Her mouth tightened. She typed quickly, then stopped staring at the screen longer than she meant to. She glanced up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place a feeling she didn't yet understand. What she asked, half defensive, half uncertain. I met her gaze calmly. "You seem distracted." She scoffed. "I'm not." But she was. They all were now. My father cleared his throat and raised his voice, attempting to pull the room back into alignment. He launched into another story, one meant to reassert control, to remind everyone who he was. The words came smoothly, but the effect was diminished. People listened out of politeness rather than deference. Authority once questioned internally never fully recovers. I felt the point of no return approaching, not as dread, but as inevitability. A deadline had been set in motion earlier that evening, one that would assert itself regardless of what was said or unsaid at this table. The truth no longer required my involvement to surface. It would arrive on its own terms. My phone vibrated softly in my pocket. I didn't react immediately. I waited a beat, then another before glancing down just long enough to read the message. Everything I needed to know was there. The timeline had accelerated. The next step was already underway. I slid the phone back into my pocket without changing my expression. No one noticed. They were too busy managing their own unease. My sister leaned toward my father again, whispering urgently now. He frowned, nodded once, then looked around the table as if reassessing the room. His gaze passed over me without stopping. I was still invisible to him, still irrelevant. That was fine. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. People waited for something without knowing what. The house felt smaller, the walls closer. Even the Christmas lights seemed too bright, too insistent. I felt calm settle deeper into my bones. Not excitement, not triumph. Just steadiness. Understanding removes fear. It replaces it with responsibility. I thought back to the moment in the kitchen when I could have left. How easy it would have been. How clean. I didn't regret staying. Some outcomes demand witnesses. My mother finally sat down, her movement slower now. She looked tired. Older. She looked at my father, then at my sister, then at me. Her eyes lingered this time, searching my face for something she hadn't asked for in years. I held her gaze steady and unreadable. The next interruption came from the hallway. Voices rose briefly, then dropped. Footsteps paused. A door opened and closed. Someone returned to the table with an expression that couldn't quite hide what they knew. My father straightened, irritation flickering across his face. "What's going on?" he asked. Nothing, the person said quickly. Too quickly. The lie hung in the air, thin and fragile. I knew then that the evening had reached its final stretch. The systems were converging. Information would surface soon, whether through a call, a message, or an unexpected arrival. The shape of it was already clear to me, even if the details were still forming. I folded my hands loosely in my lap and waited. Real power doesn't rush. It allows truth to arrive fully formed, undeniable, impossible to talk around. I had done my part by staying present, by choosing responsibility over comfort, by not interfering where interference would only delay the inevitable. They still didn't see me as a factor. They still believed their world was intact, just temporarily unsettled. They were wrong. As the room grew quieter and the tension sharpened into something unmistakable, I understood with calm certainty that the next moment would change everything. Not because I would speak, but because the truth no longer needed my voice. It was already on its way. The room shifted before anyone spoke. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. No door slammed, no glass shattered. It was the collective pause that gave it away, the subtle moment when conversations stalled and people reached for their phones at the same time, as if an invisible current had passed through the house. I felt it settle in my chest, calm and unmistakable. This was it. My father sensed it a beat too late. He lifted his glass and cleared his throat, ready to reclaim the evening the way he always had. "Let's not let dinner get cold," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're here to enjoy ourselves." The words fell flat. A few people nodded out of habit, but no one laughed. No one echoed him. The room no longer leaned toward his voice. Authority, once it slips, doesn't announce its departure. It simply stops working. My sister shifted in her chair, her confidence flickering like a bad signal. She checked her phone again, then glanced at my father. "Did you hear back?" she asked quietly, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. About what he snapped too quickly. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You said they'd confirm tonight." He waved his hand dismissively. "They will. These things take time." That was when someone stood up. It was a man I recognized, but didn't know well, someone who existed on the edge of my family's world. Close enough to understand what was at stake, distant enough not to be emotionally invested in protecting anyone's pride. He didn't look angry or triumphant. He looked uncomfortable, like someone who'd been handed a responsibility he didn't want, but couldn't avoid. "I'm sorry," he said, addressing my father first, then the rest of the table. "But we need to clarify something." The air went still. "This really isn't the time." My father replied, irritation creeping into his voice. "We're in the middle of dinner." "I know," the man said evenly. "That's why I didn't want to bring it up. But it can't wait." No one objected. No one intervened. My father's authority hesitated again, searching for traction that wasn't there. "There's been a change." The man continued, his tone professional, measured. "The assumptions we were operating under no longer apply. The decision was finalized earlier this evening." My sister's face drained of color. "What decision?" she asked, her voice sharp and thin. The man glanced at his phone, then back up. "The approval you were expecting won't be coming through. The structure isn't valid anymore." My father laughed once, short and dismissive. "That's not possible." "I'm afraid it is," the man said. "Once the exposure was flagged and reviewed, there was no way to move forward. It's done." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again. "Who flagged it?" There was a pause. Not for drama, for accuracy. "It was already under review," the man said carefully. But the final determination came from higher up. Eyes moved around the table, searching for clarity, for someone to blame. They landed on me by accident. I didn't move. My sister followed their gaze, her confusion hardening into suspicion. She looked at me more closely than she had all evening really looked. "What does this have to do with her?" she demanded. No one answered her. The man didn't say my name. He didn't need to. He spoke in facts, not accusations. There were conflicts that couldn't be resolved, decisions that had already been made elsewhere where my father asked, his voice tight now. Within the institution, the man replied. That was enough. Understanding rippled around the table slowly, unevenly. My father's certainty cracked first the way glass does under pressure. My sister's confidence followed unraveling as she realized how little control she'd ever had. My mother sat frozen, her hands folded in front of her, her face pale as she looked from one of us to the other. Someone finally said my name. I looked up calmly. Yes. The room seemed to contract around that single word. My father stared at me, disbelief giving way to something like recognition. You knew about this, he said slowly. I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it either. I simply met his gaze. What did you do? My sister demanded, her voice rising as panic pushed past entitlement. Nothing, I said. The truth unsettled them more than any confession could have. Because it meant this hadn't been an attack. It hadn't been a betrayal. It had been a consequence. The man cleared his throat. I really should go, he said quietly. I wanted you to hear it from me first. He gathered his coat and excused himself with a nod, leaving behind a table full of silence and shifting ground. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my sister pushed her chair back abruptly. This is insane, she said, pacing a step away from the table. You don't just lose something like that. Someone messed up. Her eyes snapped to me again, sharp and accusing. Unless someone made sure of it. I didn't rise to the bait. You were relying on something you didn't control, I said evenly. That's all. My father finally found his voice. Why didn't you say anything he asked? The question wasn't angry. It was confused, threaded with something dangerously close to vulnerability. I considered it, then answered honestly. You never asked. The words landed softly, but they cut deeper than shouting ever could. My mother's breath hitched. She reached for her glass, then stopped, her hand trembling. We didn't know, she said, her voice barely audible. I know, I replied. That was the hardest part for her to hear. My sister shook her head, disbelief giving way to panic. This isn't fair, she said. You could have warned us. I looked at her, then really looked. The entitlement, the fear, the sudden loss of footing. Fairness, I said quietly, was never the rule here. Her mouth opened, then closed again. The fight drained out of her face as the truth settled in. No one asked me to explain further. No one asked how long I'd known, or what position I held, or how any of it had been possible. The answers no longer mattered. The outcome had already rearranged the room. I stayed seated, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I felt no urge to stand, no need to claim space. Being seen briefly and unwillingly was enough. My father sank back into his chair, staring at the table as if it had betrayed him. My sister leaned against the counter, suddenly smaller than she'd ever seemed. My mother watched me with an expression I couldn't quite name, something between regret and awe. Eventually, conversation resumed in fragments, hollow and tentative. Plates were cleared, coats were gathered, People said their goodbyes with forced politeness, eyes darting between us, unsure how to place what they had just witnessed. As the house emptied, the silence grew louder. I stood at last, smoothing my coat, feeling the strange lightness that comes when something long carried finally loosens its grip. This had never been about humiliation. It had been about exposure, about letting reality speak where words would only have been dismissed. The version of me they had relied on no longer existed. And as I turned toward the door, leaving behind a family recalibrating in the aftermath of their own assumptions, I knew with absolute clarity that what came next wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about boundaries. And this time I wouldn't need to raise my voice to set them. The house looked the same after everyone left. Plates stacked neatly by the sink. Candles burned low wax pooling onto the tablecloth my mother would later try to save. The Christmas lights blinked softly in the corner, cheerful and oblivious. But the air had changed. It felt thinner, stripped of pretense, like something heavy had finally been lifted and taken with the guests. I stood by the doorway for a moment, listening to the quiet settle. My father remained at the table, shoulders slumped, staring at a place that no longer held authority for him. My sister moved restlessly between rooms, touching objects without purpose, as if motion alone could undo what had happened. My mother stood near the window, her reflection overlapping the dark glass, looking smaller than I remembered. No one spoke. When people finally look at you after years of not seeing you, there's a recalibration that happens in their eyes. I felt it when they glanced at me now. Not warmth, not affection. Calculation. As if they were measuring a shape they had ignored for too long, and were only now realizing it had weight. It didn't feel like victory. It felt late. My sister was the first to break the silence. She came into the kitchen, her voice carefully controlled like someone negotiating rather than speaking. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly. "You never asked," I said. She frowned, shaking her head. "We didn't know you were involved in any of this." "I know," I replied. That was the part she couldn't accept. Not that they'd been wrong, but that their not knowing had been a choice. It was easier to believe I was irrelevant than to consider they might have missed something important. My father joined us a moment later. He stood a few steps away as if distance might give him time to recover his footing. "You could have warned us," he said. The words weren't sharp. They were confused, almost afraid. I looked at him and felt nothing I could easily name. No anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet finality. "I learned a long time ago not to offer information where it isn't wanted," I said. That didn't change tonight. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time I could remember, he had no response ready. My mother waited until we were alone. She came closer than the others had, close enough that I could smell the familiar soap on her hands. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "I always knew you were capable." The words landed, but they didn't sink in the way she probably hoped. "I needed you to say something when it mattered," I told her, "not after." Her eyes filled, but she nodded. She understood the distinction, even if it hurt. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not the same as access. I didn't take back my childhood that night. I didn't reclaim approval or demand apologies. I didn't rewrite old scenes or humiliate anyone who had once humiliated me. Those things belonged to a version of justice that no longer interested me. What I took back was quieter. I took back my right to define myself without their permission. I took back my time, my energy, my emotional labor. I took back the confidence I had built far away from this table, piece by piece, without witnesses. When I left, I did so without ceremony. No slammed doors. No dramatic farewell. I hugged my mother because I chose to. I nodded to my father because it felt complete, not submissive. I passed my sister without another word. The cold air outside felt clean. The street was quiet, Christmas lights glowing softly on houses that held their own private reckonings. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, letting the stillness settle into something like peace. In the days that followed, the family dynamic shifted in small but telling ways. Messages arrived more carefully worded. Invitations were tentative, polite. Questions were asked that should have been asked years ago. I answered some. I ignored others. Boundaries once drawn only matter if you're willing to keep them. Life returned to its rhythm faster than I expected. Meetings, deadlines, decisions that mattered for reasons beyond pride. The holiday faded, but the clarity didn't. I didn't feel lighter because I had won. I felt lighter because I no longer carried expectations that had never belonged to me. Being underestimated, I realized, had protected me. It had given me space to grow without interference to learn, without pressure to build strength, without needing validation. The very thing they had used to diminish me had given me freedom. I didn't need to be seen by them anymore. That was the real turning point. I used to think revenge had to be loud to be real, that it required confrontation, exposure, humiliation. But the older I get, the more I understand that the most lasting kind of justice is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't linger. It simply changes who has access to you. If you've ever been dismissed at your own family table, if you've ever been reduced to a role that never fit, know this: silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. Sometimes it's the space where power is built quietly, where clarity forms without interference. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts or your own experience in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you want to stay with me for more stories about quiet justice, family drama, and the kind of revenge that restores dignity instead of taking it, stay with the channel and subscribe. There are more stories coming, and I'd be glad to have you here for them.